Actually, I want to do a video because all of these eschatological motifs are in some ways continuing to play themselves out. Uh-oh. Got oh. We're on. Rick's like, start.
Oh, go, go.
Welcome to the Friday morning Bridges of Meaning Discord server question and answer conversation where a very chatty Discord group gets quiet for 2 hours and only 2 hours. Except Job's in the room. Job's not afraid to talk, so it should be a good one this morning. I before I begin, I just want to say that I was listening to Nate Heil as a guy who's on the Discord server. He's not in this morning right now. I don't see him. I was just listening to his first video on his channel where he tells his story, and it's a great story. So you should check out Nate Heil's channel and his story. So I keep so many of you I need to and want to have conversations with. I haven't done a lot of conversations this week. I had a couple of randos conversations, and but the few weeks before I had a lot of them, and I always this time of year I always got to finish my taxes, and taxes are such a pain in the neck. So I got my taxes done, which make me happy now. So we're gonna have a good time this morning. Anybody have a question you want to get off your chest before I dig into the pile? No. It's a very funny thing because, on Twitter, and I get all this begging for, I can't find a rando slot. Can you get me in? Can we do a conversation? And here on Friday morning, when I basically say, okay, free for all, anybody have anything they want to say or talk about? And it's like, nothing. I don't know what to think about that. And I just wanted to mention that I'm wearing the famous pineapple shirt this morning. The pineapple shirt came out of the closet, and in celebration of finishing my taxes. So makes me happy. All right, on to the pile. We'll go from top to bottom today. Matthew, Scotland, UK. In the depraved state, all parts of us are tainted to some degree by sin. How badly does this impact our sense of humor? Depends. Some people have very depraved senses of humor. Some people sense of humor is a really fascinating thing to me. There is a video that uh, Bill Maher and Joe Rogan had a conversation about humor, and I don't know if I actually put it in one of my videos. That was one of those videos that I thought that I saw that I said this should go into my video. We are now on a portion of the Death Star hovering over Ewok land. I just want you to know that, those of you who are looking at the virtual world that Rick created for us today. Rick was a little frustrated because he worked on this all week and he didn't quite meet some of the goals that he had. He's got some really cool ideas. So last week we were in this medieval room reading the Bridger's questions on a scroll. Now you're on a screen in a Death Star sort of thing. So thank Rick for his motif. So sense of humor is a really funny thing. And gosh, sorry about that. I don't know. Depravity is also a strange thing because so often, you look at someone's story like John Newton. John Newton was the guy who wrote the great hymn, Amazing Grace, a hymn that has deeply impacted English language Christianity. And John Newton became a very prominent clergyman in England, but he, in the earlier part of his life, had been a slave trader, and so if you read his autobiography, which is a very interesting read, he never got over, he didn't believe sufficiently in grace and forgiveness in some ways, which is if he if he believed more in grace, would he have ever been able to write that hymn, Amazing Grace? Life is so full of these kinds of things. So, yeah, depravity and sense of humor. There are things that just make me laugh that I think I shouldn't laugh about this, but I find them so darn funny. Part of the reason I started the Freddie and Paul show was Freddie and I would, I'd take Freddie out to lunch and we'd just have these astounding conversations about things. And Freddie sometimes, Freddie can be annoying as all get out sometimes, but other times he's just flat out hilarious. The observations he makes about the world are so brazenly savant-like in certain moments. And, yesterday I was helping a homeless person call their mother for Mother's Day. And so then I sit there in the room because they can't manage the phone, which is why I help them. And so I'm there for the conversation. And I just have a front seat at the realities of, the most intimate formations of people in terms of the life with their parents. And I can see, sitting in front of me is a homeless person that has mental illness issues, that has substance abuse issues, that their life has fallen so apart that they can't manage actually living inside, and outside is the only way that they can sort of survive, which is just insane because surviving outside is way harder. But I'm convinced that part of homelessness is an attempt at finding sanity. So then I listen to a conversation with a parent, and it's just, sometimes I just want to laugh and cry, and those two impulses are so close. Sometimes we laugh because we don't want to cry. Sometimes we laugh because we feel like we have no more tears to cry over such a thing, and it's so completely absurd. So, boy, I have noticed, at least in my opinion, Christianity, as it forms in people's lives, brings joy. It should come as no mistake. And it brings joy not in the sense of happiness, which is, happy has become such a shallow word in our culture, and it doesn't have to be. But some of the, I don't know, when I meet people whose Christianity impresses me, I usually find they are people who know how to laugh. And they can find joy and laughter in places that a lot of other people look at and say, why would you laugh? Why wouldn't this destroy you? And so when I sit and help some homeless person call their mother, whose their relationship is, because then they talk to me about their relationship with their mother, and then I listen to the phone call, and it's just a front row seat into the surreal, the absurd, the despondent, and the hilarious. And so I think a sense of humor is a good gift of God. We're hilarious creatures, we really are. Would Jesus laugh at off-color joke or use it as a teaching moment for moral improvement? The Bible can be a pretty graphic book. Jesus seems to be pro-Bible. The whole idea of off-color is deeply connected with humor. And, Peterson talks about this a bit. It's a fascinating area. It's a fascinating area. I know for a while, one of the church planting lay preacher training chapters of my life, there was one outfit that was taking preachers to comedy clubs because there's something about the truth telling that a stand-up comedian does that preachers can learn from. And some preachers are hilarious to listen to. So, yeah, it's a great question. I don't really have any good answers. Does telling a joke which makes light of sin constitute in itself a sin, or can we righteously laugh at the quagmire that is an unsanctified life? Again, I think beneath a cultural suspicion of laughter is the unfounded assertion that laughter is affirmation. Laughter isn't necessarily affirmation. And I think in some ways, one of the best ways to respond to the devil is to laugh at him. And to say, I was doing a men's group in which we were talking about the temptations of Christ. And we were in Matthew. And you get all the way to the third temptation. And Satan is like, if you bow down to me, I'll give you this stuff. And Jesus just says, Jesus counters him and then says, be gone. And what's hilarious about that is Satan basically says, if you worship me, I'll give you this stuff. And that whole attention, Rene Girard, the combination of Jonathan Pizarro's attention and Rene Girard definition of Satan and Satan's kingdom, those things have sort of been working in my brain for a little while. And Jesus, it's hilarious because Satan just tells Jesus, I'll give you the world. And Jesus just tells Satan, get out of here. He's like he stomped his feet at a cat or a dog. Get out of here. And at that word, Satan flees. And Satan, you're trying to trick Jesus into bowing down and serving you. Now again, if you think that whole thing through, and maybe I should do a video on it because I've been thinking about it a lot lately, it's just absurd. Because Jesus, it's like there's this, my daughter adopted a cat that was a stray, and so that cat's been living with us, and it was a kitten when she adopted it, and it's a lovely little cat, and I like the cat. I like having the cat around, but sometimes the cats are pretty ambitious, and they'll look at you like, I can take you, and it's like, you're 9 pounds, I'm 240. I sort of admire the chutzpah in your little show of defiance, but you're 9 pounds. And, you have that with 2-year-olds sometimes, where 2-year-olds try to wrap their parents around their little finger, and some really foolish parents allow themselves to be wrapped around the finger of the 2-year-old, which says not much about the 2-year-old and way more about the parents. But Jesus just looks at Satan and says, be gone. This is not, you are nowhere near my equal, much less my superior. And the lies that you are spinning here have absolutely no hold on me. And I think laughter is, in fact, perfectly appropriate to a moment like that, because the devil's pretext is both the fact that he wins so much is horrible, but it's also absurdly laughable. And the world is like that. And I think in some ways, humor is sort of a low-density participation in that absurdity. And so so many of my sinful patterns are just stupid. And so much sin is simply stupidity. And in some ways, when we take it, in some ways, laughter should be exactly what we give to it, because it's the 2-year-old holding their breath in order to manipulate a parent. It's the 9-pound cat trying to back down a 240-pound man. No. We are made in the image of God. when we sin, we are not living up to how and what God made us to be. And I think humor is deeply appropriate for much of that. Laugh with those who laugh, mourn with those who mourn. So it's a great question. It's a great topic and something I don't know anywhere near enough about. Yeah, I suspect intention is key. Sometimes laughter is mockery. And again, I think mockery is appropriate. The devil offers Jesus a bargain. This bargain, it's offensive, it's mockable, it's laughable. And Jesus basically stomps his foot at the devil and says, "Be gone." You know, there's no comparison here. There's no challenge here. It is good versus evil is in some ways not a fair fight, because evil is parasitic and it only gets a hold in us when we allow it to. And the fact that we so consistently allow it to speaks about the rebellion of our hearts. So it's a great question. Any comments from the voice chat on that?
I've got something, Paul.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I recently listened to the conversation that Joe Rogan had with Dave Chappelle.
Oh.
And
Is that
Chappelle had
recent
an
on,
interesting...
is that over on Spotify? Because I haven't listened to him since he's been on Spotify.
Yeah, I listened to it on Spotify.
Okay.
And Chappelle made an interesting insight where he was talking about comedians and how, you know, they were lamenting a little bit the fact that they feel like, you know, culture is coming after comedy right now. And Chappelle said something like, you know, we're the genre of everything's going to be all right. So we're not the ones you need to be coming after. And I thought that that was insightful, because I think ultimately that's what comedy is. You know, in movies, whenever the tension gets raised really high, sometimes they insert a little bit of levity to help everybody calm down a little bit and say, you know what, everything's going to be okay. Let's just chill out a bit. And so yeah, I thought that was insightful on Chappelle's part.
I think that's really good. Thanks, Jeff. This is why we do it on Discord, because y'all together, all of us together, are way smarter than any of us alone. So that's really helpful. Thanks, Jeff. Quentin, can you compare and contrast Vervaeke's wariness towards narrative and the general fear felt with Calvinism that we have no authority agency in God's story arena? Both call into question our biased perspective of personal experience, but they do it with their own flair. Huh. That's an interesting thought. You know, Vervaeke's wariness towards narrative, you know, part of me understands it, because narrative, in a sense, because we're such narrators, and because so much foolishness is created by and expressed through narrative in our lives. I just think, again, Vervaeke's ambivalence about narrative is on one hand understandable, but people aren't going to give it up. It's just too deep. It's too basic. And, you know, in his conversation with Peugeot, the point Peugeot made is, you know, even if you can theorize that you get to a point in the atmosphere where narrative can no longer breathe, and up above it is no narrative, all the way on the way back down to the ground where people live, it's going to be back narrative again. It's sort of like dealing with air in the atmosphere. So even if you imagine that the highest realms are narrative free, life in this world is going to be narrative based. Now, I think you're really right about people's reactivity to what has become a reductive caricature of Calvinism, which is determinism. And people are offended. People are offended by that. And then they go on to become deterministic materialists, which makes no sense at all. Because either you're hemmed in by a good and loving God, or you're hemmed in by an impersonal, uncaring machine called nature. And of course, people aren't offended by, people are offended by double predestination. And double predestination is basically Calvin looking at Augustine, looking at the traditional teaching of the church in terms of divine election, and saying, well, rationally speaking, if we're destined for glory, those who are elect, then just rationally speaking, the reprobate are destined for perdition. And, how could you say that? Oh, okay, well, it's a rational observation on something, but it's also in some ways a reduction. Rationality is always sort of a reduction. And so my chief point that I've made often here, which people seem to really want to keep coming back to, is if Calvinists were simply determinists, they wouldn't live like they live. They wouldn't preach like they preach. They wouldn't act like they act. It's sort of a twisted thing to say, I'm anxious about my election, therefore I'm going to do everything I can to prove to me that I'm elect. That isn't rational. It doesn't cohere. But for people to be unrational is basically for them to be people. So I don't worry about it. I don't worry about it. But how does that connect up with Vervaeke's wariness towards narrative? Well, I think almost everything we manage in this world as pedestrian human beings, we do through narrative. And I think in some ways the element of a particular reduction of Calvinism to reprobation it's narratival, and in some ways it's a dismissal of narrative. Because a part of narrative is that agency and effort and intentionality can be productive. We tend to not like stories where someone marshals all of their effort and agency and it's pointless. In fact, Peterson keeps telling these Nazi torture stories about Nazi guards having prisoners move sacks of, heavy sacks from one side of the warehouse to the other simply because it's pointless, and to make the point of pointlessness. I think part of our deep attachment to narrative is, in fact, that narrative can be productive and human agency is consequential and meaningful. And again, for all of the dismissal of certain Calvinist tribes because of this fear of determinism, I've never found these Calvinist tribes to not affirm in their life and in their admonitions that people use their narrative in positive ways. So I don't know how much connection there is, or that at least I see between them. Maybe you see more than I do. Both call into question our biased perspective of personal experience. See, that to me gets more into this pattern of two-level theories, where someone says, I hate my mother because she's a jerk. And the psychologist comes along or the Freudian comes along and says, no, you hate your mother because you wish to replace her. And, everybody sort of trots out their school of second level theory to explain, number one, why, to give an account for what the person says about themselves, and secondly, to explain that the account is fallacious and that there's a real story going on underneath. Part of the problem with two-level theories is that there's always another one. And so they all sort of line up with sort of this, there's endless versions of Gnosticism. So again, you could look at this and say, well, maybe we can just sweep the whole thing away by underlying narrative itself, which tends to be the way that we make sense of, represent, and communicate these dynamics, because we're almost always using narrative. And even when people argue against narrative, they use narrative to argue against narrative, which, again, is a little rationally inconsistent. So, I don't know. Those are some thoughts. I'm not sure they're helpful at all. All right, Alan. Rick says, this guy really wants to get his questions answered. And so I'll try and answer it. I'll try, and obviously I'm saying things in a way that aren't communicating. And actually, so in last week's discussion, you mentioned dualism as interfering with modern understanding of Christian concepts. What did you mean by Descartes' dualism? I did not understand your answer last week. Can you simplify? How would we think differently about Christianity if we aren't influenced by Descartes' categories, mind and body? Can you be more concrete in this? So last night I listened to a good bit of Jordan Peterson's conversation with Ian McGilChrist, and it is wow, what a conversation. What a conversation. I was tremendously impressed by it, and I was listening to it while I was finishing my taxes, so I wasn't giving it my full attention. But what a conversation. And I might have my labeling wrong on this, so let's just set Descartes to the side right now. So Bob Brenton and Jonathan Pajot got into it on Twitter over Bob's dualism or non-duality, and Pajot was pretty dismissive of Bob, and then I saw that Luke waded in the comment section on one of my videos about, he was kind of taking Bob's side, so, well, there you go. There's one, there's two, and then there's three. Consciousness is monofocal. In our monofocality, dualisms are tremendously productive. Ian McGilChrist made the point early on in the video, which I thought was fascinating, that all central, Dr. James is in with Rick today, helping run the Discord server. So Dr. James is part of our local meetup, and he's a great guy. So it's fun to see them. All nervous systems are asymmetric. Why do we have these bicameral brains? And I thought that was just an astounding conversation between McGilChrist and Peterson. One of the things that McGilChrist is about, and one might rightly say he's got a real bone to pick with the left brain. He has a bone to pick with the left brain, and how, in his opinion, the master and his emissary, it has taken over Western civilization, and the right brain is not getting the leadership it deserves in the culture, let's say, which itself, I mean, these are just tremendously interesting ideas, but they're not terribly easy to talk about. And so, as every preacher knows, what you do is you create illustrations. I think I share something with McGilChrist and you've heard me talk about it in a lot of different ways if you've watched my videos, this obsession with things. We turn everything into a thing. And we're stuck in our grammar, as Vervaeke always says. And I think part of the reason we do this is because of the left brain, which we need. Let's not dismiss it or not recognize its blessings. Because in order to grasp, and Vervaeke talks about this stuff all the time, in order to grasp something, Lewis makes exactly the same point in his book Miracles, that any abstract conceptualization has to employ physical metaphors. This is built into us from before we were born. We explore our world through physicality. And in some ways, we bootstrap so you've got heaven and earth. You've got mind and spirit. You've got spirit and nature. We have all these dualities. You bootstrap knowledge of others who are human beings, are spirit and matter. We're nephesh. We're living nephesh. We're the breath of God and the stuff of earth. All of this connection, this nexus between heaven and earth, between spirit and nature, between mind and body. I mean, that's where we are. And Peugeot's brother, gets at this. I hope to take this up again soon. So that's where we are. We're right there in the middle. And in some ways, you can map this into left and right hemisphere. That's some of what's happening in that as well. Part of what happened in modernity, and I don't know if it's right to blame Descartes for this or not, was spirit became a thing. And this is, so when Rationality Rules says to Jonathan Peugeot, well, you're not one of those Christians that thinks, God is conscious, a conscious being. And I love what symbolic meme is. You're my favorite. You're my favorite text channel in this Discord. You bridges of memings. Talk about humor. I love it. I can't get enough of it. But when he does that little video with Rationality Rules talking to Peugeot, and he goes right in on Jonathan. Jonathan's like, huh? And I had exactly the same experience with Peugeot. Why does Rationality Rules listen to Jonathan Peugeot and think, well, that you're not the kind of believer that thinks God is. See, this is where I get into God number one, God number two, imagining gods as super things, imagining the Holy Spirit as a thing. Now, we can't help but talk in these terms. We can't help it because of how we are. But a big part of this channel and a big part of my ongoing journey over these last 3 years has been to try to discover a language of spirit that is derivative from the Bible. I'm a Protestant. But also makes sense in our overly left-brained culture. And one of the manifestations of that overly left-brained culture is everything is thingified. I mean, even when Vervaeke is, when he listens, there's a few times that he's talked about hyper things, and Paul Antleitner picked up on that right away. And Marcus Connolly, who I posted my conversation with him a couple of weeks ago, I mean, he sort of picked up on the super thing idea. And that's right, because we keep doing that. We keep projecting that out onto the world. And am I saying God is not a thing? Yes, God is not a thing, but we can't help but think and use those terms. And maybe I have a similar problem with this as Vervaeke has with his resistance to narrative. So Rick, I just thought of this analogy this morning. Rick is playing with this Unreal Engine. And so that's where you get this crazy little Star Wars motif that you're looking at. In an analogy, and again, what I learned from Brett Sockled about analogy, which he of course learned from Roman Catholic, we need analogy. All analogies are insufficient. Okay, so there's a duality for you. In some ways, God, number one, is like the Unreal Engine that Rick constructs these crazy little themes out of. And you don't see the Unreal Engine when you look at this little crazy Star Wars Death Star segment hovering over Ewok land. But it's completely unable to exist without the Unreal Engine. But the Christian God is, so you have Christine Hayes talking about the Hebrew Scriptures working off Kaufman, Ezekiel Kaufman. In paganism, you have this meta-divine realm that all the little gods who are things as sorts are working within, but all subject to the rules of the meta-divine realm. Certain forms of atheist modernism have sort of recreated that, but the only super things are us. And it's just a shallow worldview, which really is inútil, as you'd say in Spanish. It just doesn't work. It just doesn't serve. So Jesus says to his disciples after the resurrection in the Gospel of John, he breathes on them. And again, that word is used of God breathing into Adam, and the breath, God breathing onto the valley of dry bones in the book of Ezekiel. Jesus breathes on them and says, receive the Holy Spirit. And a little bit later in the book of Acts, Simon the Magi, the Magus, Simon the Great magic man, wants Peter to give him, though he wants a franchise rights to the Holy Spirit because Christians seem to be doing some cool tricks. That conversation doesn't go well. So why I keep coming back to school spirit? Because for me, school spirit is the illustration that it's the best illustration I've been able to come up with to give us a conceptualization of spirit that gets at this thing not thing issue. And in some ways I picked up the book that Vervaeke and JP Marceau were talking about in our last conversation, because talking about this stuff is tremendously difficult. But school spirit, is school spirit a thing? Yeah, it's a thing. School spirit's a thing. We could say, yeah, school spirit's a thing. But it's not a thing like my cell phone stand is a thing. And almost all the really important things in our life are like that. Do you participate and contribute to school spirit? Yes. Do you have agency in the realm of school spirit? Absolutely. Do you have dominion over school spirit? Potentially, but seldom. Jesus seems to have dominion over that. And again, that is a thingy. So, consciousness is monofocal. Monofocality leads to dualisms. It can't help but lead that way, because in order for us to process and think, we have to always compare and contrast. And two is sort of the easiest way. Once you bring a third thing in, it's already stretching us to consider three things. I was having a conversation with a person who has to make some decisions in her life, and they're important decisions. And one of the things that I did in terms of helping her think through these decisions was to stop triangulating in her thought process, because I almost always find that it's very difficult to decide between three things. It's almost better off, we're almost always better off to say, okay, let's it's like making a decision tree. Yes, no. Okay, so first you stack up your hierarchy, your decisions via your priority, and you figure out which decisions come first. And sometimes time is involved in that, and sometimes the enormity of the sphere or arena is involved in that. So you set up your decision tree, but you're almost always better making decisions comparing two things rather than trying to work on three. So I have deep appreciation for Bob's pursuit of non-duality. Dualities are, in some ways, always necessary, but finally frustrating. Because, in a sense, what the Christian life is finally pursuing is unity. But you can't say unity without assuming a plurality, because unity is the union of plurals. I mean, it's just the way the world works. So what we really want to do is, and I think this is one of the best conceptualizations of it, and it works narratively, it works in terms of patterns. What we're really looking for is the union of heaven and earth. That is the story of the Bible. The Bible begins with a temple text, which is Genesis 1, and then they're in the garden of the temple, and you have the gardeners, and you have division between the gardeners, and division between the gardeners and the king, and you go all the way to the end of the Bible, and it's the reunion of heaven and earth. Paul, the Apostle Paul, admonishes us to be clothed with the Spirit, admonishes us to walk by the Spirit, that the Spirit of God would fully inhabit us. And you can read on to the Hebrew Scriptures. That stuff reads on to the Hebrew Scriptures quite easily in many ways, that the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. That's a union, because it started with a duality of not knowledge in the world and knowledge, and then the knowledge covering the earth like the waters cover the sea. And even just that imagery, like the waters cover the sea. I mean, just think about that. Think about that image. How can the waters not cover the sea? The sea is the waters. I mean, it's just genius. So I probably haven't helped you a bit. I don't know if I've simplified it. But I really like C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, because he goes into what is the new creation. The new creation is, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The new creation is, the earth will be covered with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. The new creation is, just as my mind has mastery over my hand, I bid my hand to rise and appear before the camera and wiggle the fingers and poke my head and poke my nose and scratch my beard and play with my headset. This is us. This is God. This is God. The Unreal Engine is God. And so it's this kind of mastery, this kind of oneness. And that's why God is masculine and we are feminine. That's why Christ and his bride, because she longs to be at one with him. She longs for his attention. She longs for his caress. She longs for their consummation, their sexual union, so that the two are one again. We're not one. We're not one with each other. We're not one with God. We're not one with creation, our sister, the nature. We long for all of these conflicts to finally be laid to rest, and we long for consummation. The conversation I posted this morning, it was a fun conversation. It rambled a lot and was kind of all over the place, and that was okay. But part of the nuggets that I sort of gleaned out of it is, decadence is imagining you're making progress, but you're not really making progress, because what progress is getting closer to consummation. And now for some of you, because you're haven't been living in the Christian church, that word doesn't have meaning for you, except when, has the marriage been consummated? And the narrative behind that is you have an engagement, and then you have a wedding, and then after the wedding, the bride and the bridegroom retire to the marriage chamber. What happens in the marriage chamber? And again, with some royal couples and some cultures, consummation was so important that it happened that, they're demanding proof of consummation. Okay, you two, let's get busy. All of this money, all of this sacrifice, all of this energy is for consummation. And what happens in consummation between a man and a woman? Well, there's the potentiality of new life, and the story keeps going. And a lot of what we've been doing is cheating that, trying to step out of that pattern, and in some ways pursuing decadence. That doesn't make any sense. So let me just scan. He's not in the room, so we'll see if he's satisfied with this answer. He'll ask the question again next week. Hello, Paul. The first step of Alcoholics Anonymous is we admit we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. For many who have taken the steps, they find that alcohol is a symptom and not the problem. Indeed. I'm trying, for my own curiosity, to reframe the first step for people suffering from a meaning crisis and desperate for a solution to that problem. Okay, so in a sense, you want to try to objectify the meaning crisis, to turn it into a thing. And the part of the reason that the 12-step program works is alcohol is a thing. Drugs, street drugs are a thing. Overeaters Anonymous, food is a thing. Well, see, and I think in some ways, the further down the feeding chain you go with 12-step programs, Sexaholic Anonymous, what's the thing that sex addicts are trying to get a handle on? And as you very rightly said, sex isn't the problem. The street drugs aren't the problem. The food isn't the problem. The alcohol isn't the problem. There's a problem underneath that is manifesting itself in using this substitution. They're using alcohol or drugs or sex as a substitution, usually for something like a relationship, which, again, we have to thingify, but it's deeper than a thing. And we use this. I was talking to one meetup group once, and I said, what if you gave your marriage a name? They kind of looked at me like, why would I give my marriage a name? Because in some ways, your marriage is a thing. What would that name be? And then you probably wouldn't name it Fred or Carol, unless you had an idea of a Fred or Carol that somehow intuitively your marriage reminded you of. You probably give it a name that had resonance, that you might name it after a war. You might name it after a beautiful piece of art. You might name it after a lovely piece of music. A lot depends on what your marriage is like. So Yeah. I think it's going to be more difficult employing. I mean, the genius of 12 steps is that it takes a pattern in people's lives and through the steps helps them see that it's not alcohol. And again, for certain people, biochemically, it might be more for them than it is necessarily for others, but that there are patterns in their life. Now we're using patterns as things, but that's just what we're going to do right now in Peugeot's world. There are patterns in their life that need to be addressed, and alcohol is the presenting symptom. And one of my best friends who was he came to this church basically because in this way he graduated from AA, and he ran out of things that he could work the 12 steps on, and church was in a way the place. It was the graduate degree for what the 12 steps was sort of remedial with. And I don't want to necessarily stack them because a lot of churches, if they would incorporate a lot more 12 step stuff, would be a lot more productive with people's lives. But people's lives are so broad that it's difficult to reduce it to one thing, like I drink too much, I'm doing heroin, I'm doing porn or having serial affairs, cheating on my spouse, or I'm gambling, or I mean, if you have everything sort of coming to a point in one thing, it's a little bit easier to address because you can focus on that one thing, and by focusing on that one thing, begin to see the pattern. For most people, there are actually lots of things going on, none of which are rising to the life-destructive pattern of, let's say, alcohol in a person's life, but this whole menagerie of smaller little demons are what are destroying their life and their marriage and their families. And that's a lot harder to get at because you talk to the spouse and the spouse says, well, you always do this and you always do that and you always do that. It's like, well, okay, let's get always out of the conversation. Let's get a little bit more specific about the patterns. Well, there's this pattern over here. Okay, that pattern is probably developed from their home of origin. And I mean, it's much more complex to defuse. And so often what happens, let's say someone's an alcoholic and they get the alcohol thing under control. Now they're still left with all of these other things underneath. But it's sort of like there are things you can't live with, like a heart attack. And there are things you sort of live with, like diabetes, high blood pressure, diabetes. Let's use diabetes. You can live with diabetes. Now, diabetes is going to take you out. It's a serious medical condition, but it's not acute. I got Dr. James in the other room watching me, and he's probably going to either say yes or no to my wandering over into his realm. Diabetes isn't going to take you out right now, but over the long term, it's going to kill you. Most of what I deal with in churches are diabetes and high blood pressure conditions in people's lives. If you have a heart attack, well, that's, then suddenly the medical establishment it's a heart attack. Let's look at blockages in the arteries to the heart. Let's look at, and then once you say, save them from their heart attack, now suddenly it's like, okay, now we're going to look at diet, exercise, lifestyle, and family history and try and prevent the second one. I'm getting good signs from the AV room from Rick and Dr. James. So, but most of our lives are all these symptoms down below, and the meaning crisis is more like diabetes and high blood pressure than it is like a heart attack. And that's going to be the difficulty of trying to employ a 12-step program to a meaning crisis, because it's really helpful when you have a dramatic presenting symptom that you can go after. Going after diabetes, going after obesity It's a lot harder. So let's see. Is there a word that describes the common problem or common symptoms of the meaning crisis? If you haven't watched Vervaeke and Christopher Mastro-Pietro's Symptoms of the Meaning Crisis, that's an outstanding video, and I just wish the sound quality had been better. They should really redo that video or do it again, probably with more of what they've known, because it's an outstanding video for this very reason. You know, I remember being in the Dominican Republic, and check that off your PVK bingo, and you'd see these health brigades come down to the Dominican Republic, and they would sit down with people in the room, and, you know, you have all these usually 20-something North Americans coming down, and you can easily gather a crowd of poor people because they're going to give out stuff. You know, life is boring. We don't have a lot of entertainment. So you got these usually well-dressed, good-looking, very friendly, generous, probably going to give away some free stuff, or maybe be able to build a relationship and maybe get a visa para sueño, a visa to the United States, a visa for your dreams. It was a very famous Dominican song when I was there. And so they gather people around and they say, there are these invisible things called germs, and they're all over the place. And those are the things that make you sick. And so what you really need to do is keep the pig out of the house and put in a cement floor and not let the baby crawl around in the dirt of your little community, and boil your water. And so what they're basically asking the people to do is expend a whole lot of their limited energy and resources on the quest to fight invisible things. Now, if I tell it that way, it sort of sounds crazy, like new atheists complain about Christianity. Oh, there's this invisible thing that you pray to and he gives you things? That's just crazy. Well, flip the script and go into a poor community and say, the world is covered by these invisible things, and you have to do all of these crazy things that seem completely costly, labor-intensive, annoying, repetitive, unfruitful, in order for you to not have your children get parasites and scabies, and to somehow push down the infant mortality rate in your communities, which are horrendous. And the people just look and smile and think, when are they going to give away the good stuff? That's how we are. And that's how the meaning crisis is. Well, there's these invisible things that are plaguing your life. And I'm going to ask you to do all sorts of things which make no physical sense to you. And they cost you time and money and energy. And they're sometimes boring and repetitive and annoying. And you may or may not see an immediate benefit from it. It's almost the definition of religion. But that's going to address your meaning crisis. And, take it into the Mark Lefebvre Awakening from the Meaning Crisis area and say, okay, you're going to sit in a room, close your eyes, and do nothing for an hour. Well, but doing nothing is really hard. Yeah, so why should you do it? Why don't you just watch TV? Why don't you just go to work? Why don't you just play chess? Well, because when I stop and I meditate, I realize how active my brain is. Well, of course it's active. You want it dead? Isn't the opposite of active dead? So it's a challenge. It's a challenge. And it's a challenge because unlike an alcoholic who, let's say, is falling asleep in front of the TV every night, depending on whether they're a happy drunk or an angry drunk, they're happy, but they don't do anything. Or they're angry and they're always yelling and complaining and everyone is walking on eggshells. And at some point, people just say, screw you, and get out of their life. There's all, but it's easy to point to alcohol or someone who is, they just can't stay faithful to their spouse. It's easy to point at that. Meaning crisis, it's more like diabetes, heart disease, or germs in a Haitian bate. So I'm Trying to steer away from the religious and heady philosophical words. Yeah, and these are so it's a good challenge. See what you can do with it, but without a presenting symptom that is visible and obvious to everyone around, it's much more difficult to make progress. And that's part of the challenge of, let's say, a church versus AA. You're in the room, Chad. I don't know if you want to rebuttal. He might. Oh, he
no rebuttal. You just pointed out exactly my problem. It's so difficult to find something that makes sense that I can try and convey. But thanks for taking it on.
Well, in some ways, Peterson has been really successful at it. But Peterson, in a sense, was able to draw on a broader cultural, again, I'm old enough to remember before we had the internet, before we had computer games, before we had all of these distractions that are so ubiquitous and cheap. I mean, a computer with an internet connection has gotten really cheap and really available. And that's made porn, video games, all sorts of sort of human junk food really available. When I was younger, people were into music. And music was a little bit out there. Guys were into fixing their cars. Girls were into guys, and guys were into girls. A lot more than they're getting into each other right now, apparently, if I read the news correctly. People were tending to, there was drugs and sex and there was all of that, but people were tending to arrange their lives around physical things more, and now they're arranging their lives around these virtual things. And it's a tougher thing. Peterson was able to, in some ways, conceptualize the basement dweller on computer games and porn covered with Cheetos, never getting a girl, never getting a job, never finishing a degree, not going anywhere in their life. That picture was the thing that Peterson could project and address. And he could use that as sort of the focal point to bring about the transformations that he did. So if you can draw a picture, and I'm saying that metaphorically, if you can draw a picture of what the meaning crisis looks like and distill it into a little narrative that tons of people can identify with and are looking towards addressing in their lives, you can make some progress. But it's not as easy as alcohol. All right. Further beyond, Eddie. I pray, but I do not feel it. How do I pray with all my heart and soul? You may very well be praying with all of your heart and soul. I mean, that's kind of the point of this Mother Teresa book, is she not only prayed with all of her heart and soul, she lived with all of her heart and soul, and she never felt it. Now, it sucks. Trust me. Because we want to feel it. We want the feels. We just do. But both God and our communal physical world around us don't prioritize the feels as much as each of us as individuals do. If you're the kind of parent that your kids are small and little kids, what do they need? They need stability. They need food to be in the fridge, dinner to be on the table, the lights to be on, the heat to be working. They need adults to care for them. If you get up in the morning and your kids are hungry and they need to get dressed and they need to go to school and you say, I'm just not feeling it, those kids are going to suffer. So I also know I did a conversation with Sevilla King yesterday, which was really an outstanding conversation. She challenged me on psychedelics. That's going to be, the comment section's going to be hot on that video because psychedelics are this issue. Psychedelics seem to generate the kind of intense disagreement that theological debates do, and I think that's interesting. So I also know that in some ways, if you're raised with religion, your ability to cultivate the feelings and to deploy the mental relational machinery is easier because you've been raised in it. I think you keep seeking, just like this woman did. And I know I'd love to give you an answer that is feel good, but if you read many lives of saints, The Dark Night of the Soul, read C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, sometimes being married to God is no fun at all. It's just true. It's a great question. Keep pouring your heart and soul out to him. Let him come to you. And he might withdraw himself from you in this way in order to prune you and make you into the kind of saint he knows you can become through him. So, wish I had I was going to say, wish I had a pill for you, but apparently that's what the psychedelic conversation is about. Matthias, Paul, in your recent episode with Mark Lefevre, you mentioned once again that in the Bridges of Meaning conversations, people would focus too much on Christianese terms and topics. What exactly would you like to see changed in the discussion on this server? I think people do need a space to nerd out theologically and have their battles and disputes. I think I'm glad that the server hosts conversations like that. But part of the reason we created the forum was other people coming onto the server get weary of endless debates around topics that will not be resolved. Again, there's so much interesting stuff in that Peterson McGilChrist conversation. I mean, McGilChrist was going into, he basically said part of the reason we have these paradoxes and tensions is in some ways the difference between the mapping of the left and right hemisphere. That these two ways to view the world, tools by which we need to engage the world, their differences create those paradoxes and tensions. Now, what happens with certain kinds of theological debates are they can sometimes be bonding in terms of community for the people. You see this in married couples. You'll find a married couple that has the same fight again and again and again and again and again. Sometimes that fight's frustrating for them, but even if the fight feels frustrating for them while they're in it, if the fight stops, in some cases the marriage ends. Oh, that's funny, because you'd think the fight stopping should make the marriage a good marriage, because no, they somehow derived their community around the fight. Valhalla seems to be that thing. They fight every night and then, or fight every day and then wake up the next morning and fight again. They want the fight. But first of all, it's not my Discord server. And I've been very clear about that. I'm happy to support it. I'm thrilled about what it's become. I love participating in it, but I'm bringing a lot of my the structure of Christian Reformed pastorship, which is, this isn't my church. I don't own the building. There's a council that runs the church. I work for the church. I serve the church. And so I'd rather serve this Discord server than own it. And my advice with respect to these things would be, and I think Joey has done a great job with this because he's been very attentive to the kinds of conversations that you need different rooms because people are in different spaces. And I've loved the fact that this is a place where people can nerd out over theological conversations, where people who want to explore some of the topics that I explore in my videos can come and find other people who are interested in the same topics. I think that's a function. But everybody sort of, just like, because I identify as a Calvinist, everybody wants to talk about determinism and free will. Okay. I don't see it as a conversation that goes too far, so I tend to sidestep it. No, but you're a Calvinist. Oh, okay. Well, what shall I call myself instead? A Christian? Well, then we're going to talk about the super thing and the new atheists. Okay. And on and on and on and on and on. So we need different spaces for different conversations. Basically, when you look at an estuary, let's say you go down to, I live on the California coast. Drive down the California coast. It's just gorgeous. Stop by. There's all these little areas that water is coming out of the coastal range and making its way down to the beach. And then you might have some rock. And in those rocks, there's all these little holes. And in those holes, there's all these little organisms. And churches have those. You have a big space for doing big things, but then you have all these other little rooms where people can get together, or they can share a cup of coffee. That's the circulatory system of the church. And so you can have your battle royales, but just don't subject everyone to them. Let them find another space where they can talk about other things. Life is diverse that way. And it's a cool thing where I can go here and meet these people who are wrestling with tensions between Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy and Protestantism, and I can meet these people that are dealing with modernity and religion. And so there's lots of different people around, and so I just encourage that one conversation doesn't dominate the whole thing. Let there be diversity. Let people get to express themselves. And that's especially important in terms of people's own growth and development. So in churches, a lot of people who come to churches because we have been groomed by this consumerist culture, a lot of people who come to churches want the church to sort of be a consumer organization that offers them what they want. It's rather narcissistic, but that's our culture. What often happens in churches is that I break things up and someone says, well, Pastor, I think we should have this. Good, start it. No, I don't want to start it. I just want to have someone else start it and carry it, and I can bear the fruits of it. Well, then you're going to have to go someplace else that's already doing it because we don't have it here, and you're the first one that said we needed it, so you start it. And, well, I don't know how to do it. Well, I don't know either, so you should go and learn. And, well, I don't want to do it alone. We'll find someone who's a little bit interested in maybe starting with you, and you two figure it out. And so if you can actually establish an ecosystem where people take ownership of their own things and run with it, the guys who set up this Discord server, if I set up this Discord server, none of this would be here because I just would have messed it up. And instead, what we have here are all of you doing different things, using your gifts for the benefit of the group. But that requires a lot of distributed leadership, which requires trust. And in between that distributed leadership, what you actually learn to do is establish a culture and a community where there are more norms than we can articulate. We can sort of see it when it's being violated, see it when it's being threatened, or maybe when it's being transformed into a new level, into a new thing. That's how human beings work and develop and create community, and all of that is happening. So I have no problem with nerdy theological conversations. Just don't kill the whole community with them. And so leaders in a community like this have to always be sensitive to that. And so, the admins here are always closing some threads, opening new threads, and, listening for feedback. And it's a very live situation. But if it's functioning right, what you're actually doing with people is that people all along the way, and not everybody will stay and not everyone will be a leader, but people all along the way are building up and growing and finding it interesting and finding it valuable and building community. Now, again, this is what happens in church. And people sometimes come into church and say the church should have a great show. Well, some churches do great shows, but the show itself is not what I'm looking for. What am I looking for? I'm looking for people to grow in agency and to gain gifts and skills and to be affirmed. And it's also true that in that process, people create friendships and community. And when all of this stuff is happening, you actually built a very non-fragile, robust community where others can come in and engage in the process. Now, this is tremendously complex. Churches have their own lifespans. Sometimes churches that are really functioning well, turning inward, are really unable to bring new people in. For many people who are not accustomed to religious communities, you have no idea of the amount of books and literature and conversation and discussion that there is out there in and around the professional clergy tribes around all of these kinds of issues. It is, in fact, an entire discipline. And it's a needed discipline because whereas you might look at me and say, well, Paul does YouTubes and Paul talks about ideas and Paul talks to people. All of that for me is a way of pursuing another end, which is, yeah, y'all will get used to my face and my voice and my craziness, but I want you to know each other. Because when you meet Rick, who is real, when you meet Joey, when you meet Jeff, when you meet Ivan, when you meet Jacob, when you meet Andrea, when you meet Anthony, when you meet Chad, when you meet Josiah, when you meet and not all these people you have a Dunbar number and you only have so many people you can have a relationship with. But these relationships, when they're healthy, when they're good, when they're not globalizing, but when they're appropriate, this is the stuff that makes life worthwhile. The money, the status, the fame, comes and goes. But these relationships, the people you call when you're in trouble, the people that call you when they're in trouble, the people that come to your deathbed and show up at your funeral, the people that you get angry with or cry with or laugh with, this is the stuff that makes life worthwhile. This is the stuff that pushes back the meaning crisis. So that's and this little Discord server will never be all things to all people. This Discord server has its own Dunbar number. And it's a good thing that these things are limited, because anything that takes over the world is probably demonic in the way that this world keeps getting taken over. So, when Andre, when he came into this place, he found friends. And through those friends, he found new ideas and new practices in his life. And that's what a church is. That's what a church is. And that's how churches create fabrics of culture. You would never have so many of the good and some of the bad things in American culture if the church hadn't been here. Because the church is training people how to be and to do and to be with. Family does it too. But church is sort of, in America, we don't have these big kinship relationships often because people move around too much, et cetera, et cetera. Church has sort of been here at that layer. And in some weird ways, this Discord server is. And so I just want to make sure, and this is what I do in church too, once people have their little happy huddle, oh, we like each other, we have great conversations, we trust each other, we know each other. Here's a little small group trick. Always have an empty chair. What do you mean always have an empty chair? And you make a point, you say, here is the empty chair. And you say, Pastor, this is just a trick. Yeah, it is a trick. But we always have the empty chair because we say, this is the space for the next person. And then the group says, I don't know if we want any new people. New people are dangerous. Yeah, they are. But new people are also your frontier. And they're going to be a pain in the neck when they come in, maybe. Or they'll be a joy, maybe. Probably some of both. But the group that doesn't have the empty chair, that doesn't have the space for the next person, is the group that is already dying. And the group that can't multiply and share the good things that they've discovered with each other to other people. And you might say, yeah, but some of these other people are going to be jerks. Yeah, you're a jerk to some other people too. So what we do in this place is we learn to love each other. We learn to love jerks. We learn to love annoying people. And actually in the process of community and relationship, given enough time, the jerks and annoying people usually don't stop completely being annoying and don't stop completely being jerks, but they're less jerky and less annoying and have greater capacity for human community, and along the lines become more able to be better husbands and wives and fathers and sons, and better employees and better neighbors and better. It's the slow, patient, very quiet work that church and communities do to improve the world. And the mechanism is always love. So that's what I want to see. I want to see us love each other, even the jerks, even the annoying people. And sometimes there needs to be discipline, and we got our enforcers in here, and you all know who they are. But the child who is never disciplined probably doesn't have a parent who loves them. So that's my vision for communities that I love to participate in, and I love to lead. And I think it's a vision of the kingdom of God. So that's my answer. Oh, I am such a bad time manager when it comes to these things. In your decades of ministry, has there been biblical themes and books that have come into vogue and then faded away? Oh, all the time. Christian ministry in America is so faddish. But what's interesting is that the fads usually illuminate different areas and they come back. It's sort of like, here's a funny thing. You go to the shore and someone might talk about sea level. You say, okay, what's sea level? And you look at the ocean and it's all these waves. So just take someone out into the surf at the coast and say, show me sea level. And they'll have a hard time because the waves come in and the waves go out and the waves come in and the waves go out. Where's sea level? And of course, someone would say, well, we need a mathematical approach. Yeah, you really do. But church is like that. So I sat down this week with Josiah, who has to do a paper on Christian Reformed church history in Sacramento. And so I just told him a lot of stories. And, the Seeker Church, which is a big church with a big show and a big preacher and, everything at scale, that's something that is one of the waves in Christianity. Church fathers were celebrity pastors. Think about it that way. Small groups, a lot of what I just talked about in terms of the empty chair, that's a lot of small group methodology. House churches, cell churches. These things come and go in various different packages, and sometimes churches are all about pastoral care. Sometimes churches are all about leadership. Sometimes churches are all about theology and preaching. Sometimes churches are all about serving the poor. Tim Keller had this really cool idea that he got from a seminary professor of his at college. Joey writes to Nate, Nate, you got banned because I don't like you. I like Nate. I continue to appeal for Nate's unbanning. Give Nate a second chance. Joey's like, but I'm not gonna, Joey's in charge more than I am. And that's so you let the community manage the community. The pastor shouldn't be a dictator. The pastor already has way too much power. Let the community manage the community. Otherwise, it's just an extension of the pastor. Anyway, where was I going? CRC church history, Josiah, fads in the church, small group methodology. Yeah, these things just come and go and come and go. Oh, Tim Keller's idea that he got from his college mentor. Way back when they were just recording and podcasting a lot of Tim Keller stuff. Tim Keller made an observation. He said revival. Now, again, if I say revival, poor Mark Lefebvre thinks about his traumatic visit to the Billy Graham shrine near where he lives. Revival is not a tent with sawdust. We call that a revival meeting, but that meeting is pursuing what we really mean with revival, which is a mass movement of Christianity when it grabs a culture or a city or a nation, and it's like nitrous oxide. You know, you have these car movies where they hit the nitro and it just that's what happens in revival. And Tim Keller noted that, because you can look at these things in church history and they're fascinating to study. And he notes that in revival, Richard Foster has this wonderful book on streams of living water, which basically says, here are all the different various ways that the church expresses itself. Imitatio, divine paradigm, the contemplative, the holiness tradition, the charismatic tradition, the social justice tradition, the evangelical tradition, the incarnational tradition. Well, when revival hits and it's not something we produce, it's just something, it's a spirit that just takes over. And it happened in Korea at the beginning of the 20th century. It happened in New York City, and there are various ones in the 19th century, and it's a flow. It's when the church gets into a flow state. And what Keller noted was that all of those traditions, it's like Voltron, they all come together, and they are. Evangelism is happening, and care for the poor is happening, and contemplation is happening, and prayer life is rich, and people are writing hymns like crazy, and it's nitrous oxide in the car, it's the flow state, it's all of these things, and it's just a whoosh, and all of the different aspects just come into alignment, and it flows. And then it ends. And why does it end? It's God's agency. We're just going to have it end. Then it ends. And so the pastoral themes in books are usually those elements that are having their moment and then they recede. And they have their moment and then they recede. They're like the waves. And they keep coming. So I remember when I was here, fairly fresh, and at that point the church was like, oh, we want to do things, so pastor, you go to these conferences. So I was going to these conferences, and that's all fine. I was talking to the retired pastor who had been at this church years before. He says, yeah, I used to go to conferences. Yeah. Well, the things you're talking about now, I heard them all 40 years ago. And he was right. Because I'm the old guy now, and the young guys are going to conferences like, I spend my conference money buying books, because you can spend $200 for a conference, or you can buy the book for $15. I can get way more conferences if I buy books. I got to read them though. But the real fun of conferences is being together with the people. That's the real work of it, and that's worth the money for a conference, is to be together with the people. But yeah, the fads come and go, and the biblical themes, same thing. These things just keep coming through like waves, and then every now and then you get a revival, and it's like a productive tsunami of grace that just does amazing things. So, Job, what is the most difficult part of pastoral work? I imagine it's the parts around death. No, it isn't. The most difficult part of pastoral work is stuckness. It's people who are stuck. And they might be stuck in a drug and alcohol problem. They might be stuck in a relational problem. It's almost always the relationship stuff. And they're stuck. And you pray, and you counsel, and you work, and you help, and they just stay stuck. You know, California is just going to spend billions of dollars on homelessness, and I just think some people will be helped by that. You know, probably one of the biggest things that they really need to do in this state is figure out how to get housing prices lower, more affordable, because that's part of what's killing this state right now. But homeless people, some of them, yeah, they need a little bit of help, and they'll be homeless only temporarily. But most of the homeless people, the people on the street that I deal with, they are stuck. And there's no end of money that you can throw at them. And they will still be stuck. A part of the idolatry of government is an idolatry of economics, that you think, well, it's just money and stuff and power that will fix everything. I think it's foolishness. So stuckness is the hardest part of ministry. Death is at least the end of stuckness for some people, and they will not suffer anymore. And after they die, give them to the Lord. I can't help them. They're in the grave. So no, it's not death. It's stuckness. Have you ever performed an exorcism or witnessed one? What are your experiences with thoughts on negative supernatural? It's real. It's uncommon. Most of what plagues most people is common by definition. It's not always easy to tell what's common from what's uncommon, because people are individuals. So I've never been a part of anything like you'd see in The Exorcist, or you can read about them. I mean, they're on the internet. I mean, people are fascinated by these stories of the. See, I've been thinking about maybe doing a video on. Peugeot just did his video on Little Nas X and that imagery, and then on Rene Girard. And so when we're talking about the satanic or the demonic, there are actually a number of things that we're talking about. But spirits that are spirits are all around us. And so this thingness that develops around our imagination of the demonic, those stories are among us in many ways because they are real stories. But most of what you see with people are the common things. And so I like C.S. Lewis's admonition. There are two equal and opposite dangers with respect to this realm: thinking too much and denying its existence. And so your majority rule should be with dealing with the common. And generally speaking, when it comes to manifestations of really powerful spirits, agents that are non-human in uncommon ways, deal with those things as extraordinary. But, frequency of miracles. So it's real, but most of what I deal with is just way, way too common. It's just garden variety human beings doing their stuff. How have your sermons changed over the years? That's an interesting question, Job. They're just like the fads question. I've had fads in preaching for a while. I was using a lot of movie illustrations for preaching. And then I kind of gave up on that because people in my church are too old to watch movies. I'd use a movie illustration and nobody had seen the movie. So what am I doing? I'm a very selfish minister, and I'm a very selfish YouTuber in that I sort of preach and teach on things that I'm working through myself. And hopefully there's some overlap between what people need and what I'm working through. I try to listen and see what others are dealing with and understand so I can be helpful to them. But I actually, with my sermons, follow a very simple structure that I learned not in my seminary homiletics class, but in my seminary Christian education class. It's from a book by Charles Groom called Christian Religious Education. And it's basically a 5-step thing. I'm a little unusual in that most sermons begin by a reading of the text and then an explanation of the text. That's what most sermons purport to do. Many preachers don't do that. Many preachers read the text and then go on to say whatever the heck they want to say about whatever it is they want. They read a book or they heard a story, and it's terribly disorganized. I have sort of this 5-step movement where I name present action, I do some analysis of the present action, and then I bring in the scripture, and then I compare the present situation with the scriptural analysis, and then the conclusion is somehow the outcome that analysis should present to the world and that we should live out. So that's basically the structure of my sermons, but there are other substructures like misery, deliverance, gratitude. I'm such a non-directive person that I don't give explicit instruction often. And this has come through, many have commented on my videos that I'm much more of an explainer or an analyzer rather than a do this, don't do that. There are reasons for that. Some good, some bad. So part of the reason I stick with misery, deliverance, gratitude is I just get up and talk for 20 or 30 minutes and there's no point or application. It's also easy to get up and talk and just preach works and not grace. And so misery, deliverance, gratitude is a trick that I play on myself to make sure that my sermons are always more about grace than they are about works. So, but yeah, they continue to change. If you had a 3-month sabbatical coming up, how would you spend it? I just actually, so I've never had a sabbatical in my whole professional life. And a lot of you would say, so what? Sabbaticals are weird. Why do professors and some ministers get them and not everybody? That's a good point. I was talking to someone who walked the Camino. It's a Convo's conversation that I've had a lot of Convos. I've had a lot of Rando's conversations that people haven't wanted to record or, thank you, Gregory, for your super chat. Rick just came in. When I get a super chat, Rick comes in with a sign because I can't turn my head over. So thanks, Greg. You haven't seen a lot of Rando's conversations on the channel, even though I've been having them, because many people have good sense and say, I want to talk to you, but I don't want it recorded and I don't want it shared because it'll muck up my life. And I completely respect that. At the same time, it means that some of the best Rando's conversations I have, I can't talk about or share, but that's sort of pastoral ministry too. My father wrote a book after he retired of a lot of his pastoral ministry. Some of the best stories aren't in there because he couldn't tell them, because people have a right to privacy, and it would hurt them to tell stories. It would hurt their reputation. It would hurt their children and grandchildren to know terrible little details about people's lives. So anyway, but I was having a Rando's conversation with, again, someone else who had done the Camino in Spain. And I remember a friend of mine did it. John Van Donk's done it. And I remember when I first heard about it, I thought, but another part of me thought, yeah, I'd like to go to Spain and walk the Camino. I always thought, okay, if I did a sabbatical, what would I do? You know what I'd probably do? I'd probably work because I like what I do. I'd probably make videos. I'd probably want to preach sermons. I love what I do. I love it. I'm terribly blessed. And I love what I'm doing right now. And I love making videos. And I love being a preacher and a pastor. I love all of it. And so I don't necessarily feel the need for a sabbatical because my life is a sabbatical. But then I thought it would be really cool to walk the Camino. Then I thought, So then I got thinking. And then I was listening to the Peterson. Kind of what's nice about talking to you folks is good chance many of you have watched the videos that I've watched, and almost nobody in real life, apart from the meetup in Sacramento, watches the same videos I watch. So I can't talk to my wife about them or my kids about them, except Jared. And then I listened to Rando Wallace talk about, when I go and visit a place, I don't want to just visit Rome for a week, because you don't, even if you visited Sacramento for a week, you wouldn't know Sacramento. You should visit Rome for 3 months, 6 months, or a year. And I thought, that would be a good thing to do in retirement. And my wife is a little concerned because when my father retired, my mother talked to me and said, he's retired. He gets up in the morning and he goes into his office. I'm not really sure what he does in there. And I thought when he retired, and I said, Mom, you thought he would do what when he retired? He does what he's always done because he loves what he's always done. And then my wife saw that and she said, you're not going to be that way. And I thought, I might. She's like, I don't want that. It's like, oh, this could get rough. So then I'm going to have to think about a way to, because it's not fair to her. So then I have to think, okay, I have to find something to do in retirement that's going to be some of what she wants and some of what I want. And we both like traveling together. But she says, and I always tell her, I says, I want to go and I want to start meetups and meet randos and have conversations. She says, I don't want to follow you around while you're meeting all these strangers, because she's an introvert and I'm an extrovert. So I said, well, we can kind of do it, maybe you and I'll have a couple days and then I'll have a meeting. And then she says, oh, that would be okay. So we're negotiating. But I thought, yeah, move to London for 3 months. Because Tom Holland is always tweeting he's going on these little tours in London, and I'm thinking that would be cool. And well, you go to Europe for a week or two, and you want to see everything, and so it's like, why not go to Europe for 3 months or 6 months? You can only do that in retirement. So If I had a sabbatical right now, I'd probably say, I'm going to do the Camino. That would be cool. Because, hey, I speak some Spanish. I'm more curious about the sacramental traditions of the church now than I ever was. And then so you're going to turn Catholic? No. You're going to go Orthodox? No, I just trimmed my beard, see? I'm Protestant again. So that's how I think I'd spend it. Why do you shave your beard? The public demands an answer. It's very simple, Job. I can shave every day, or I can shave once a quarter. I like shaving once a quarter. So, and my wife's always like, well, wouldn't you like to, so she bought me this trimmer and says, well, now with this trimmer, you can just shave it regularly and it'll be easy. But then it's like, then I got to shave it regularly. So that's why my daughter, made that, made that graphic of, and then the kids will look at what stage is Dad's beard? Mall Santa is like stage 3, and then uh-oh is stage 4, and that's when I cut it all down. So there's the answer, Job. Oh gosh, more questions. Okay. End of questions. March 14. Okay, now I'll remember. See, I'm learning. Feature bug. That's a cool name. Recently, Cosmic Skeptic had a video in which he pointed out what he thinks is the biggest problem for Christianity. The problem of animal suffering. That's a big one. That's an issue. He points out 2 aspects of that. The ill treatment of animals by humans, factory farming, which is recent, and the brutal lives of animals in the wild. Yeah, that's true too. And there is no good that can come from an animal suffering because they don't have free will. Is it a problem for Christianity? How do you see it? I don't think suffering. Here's an irony about atheists pointing out suffering as a problem for Christianity. Christianity actually addresses suffering with a future that can scale to individuals, potentially including animals. I don't see that the atheist has any answer to this problem. Now, if you have a problem that is a problem for Christians and atheists and everyone else, yeah, it's a problem. But you might say, well, I'm skeptical about your worldview because a good God wouldn't create such a world. That's a good point. And so my next conversation with JP Marceau and John Vervaeke, we're supposed to deal with that because that's John's challenge. And so I've been thinking about maybe I should do a video to think about some of these things out loud first. And it is a challenge, but it's not a new challenge. And I think Alvin Plantinga has demonstrated it's not actually a technical philosophical challenge because it's actually fairly easy to get around. It's that, well, a good God might have a reason for this that we can't know. Now, that's not a terribly pastorally satisfying answer because part of human satisfaction for us is that we leverage meaning against suffering. And if we know the meaning, there's almost no, we can endure almost any suffering if we know the meaning. And the answer to the question of all suffering is meaning, but a meaning that maybe we don't or can't know. So it's not a very satisfying answer. But I think as Alvin Plantinga pointed out, there's no problem with the answer. Philosophically, rationally, logically, the problem is pastorally. But here again, Christianity has an advantage that atheism doesn't have. Because whereas I might not be able to attest to the meaning behind all suffering, that's sort of theoretical to you. What I am able and willing to do, and what Christ in fact does, is come down into our suffering and join us. Atheism doesn't have that either. And so, yeah, it's a good point, but it's sort of like standing on a beach watching a tsunami saying, I don't believe in your God because of the tsunami. oh, okay. It's still going to wipe you out. You don't have an answer. I at least can, via my faith, appropriate comfort and meaning, because I can say, my God is bigger than the tsunami, and though he slay me, yet will I trust him. What's the atheist got? He got nothing. About the best he can do is say, I will proudly stare into the maw of nothing, and he's basically got pride. So, okay, if that's your option, go for it. Me, I'll take my religion every day of the week, because I look at what you got and I look at what I got, and I think what I got works for me. Can I answer every question in the world? No. But I am part of a tradition that has plenty of Bible verses that says, the world is too big for me, and I am small, and I am limited, and I will die. But I know that my Redeemer lives, and yet will I see him. So I don't see that they have anything that compares to that. And if they do, I'm anxious to hear it. But I think they're finally and fundamentally more reactive, because I think it's easier to be an atheist around religious people, because you have something to push against. And I don't mean that in the personal sense. I mean that in the historical sense, that the majority position is religion for human beings. Atheism is a tiny little minority that seems to only be sustained or sustainable in the world of vastly religious people. And I think in some ways, oh, $5 from Anthony. Thank you, Anthony. Rick came in with another sign. This is old school super chat. Where was I going? Well, atheism and religion. I think atheism sort of looks at the religious options and says, "Ugh, that's fair enough." But if they didn't have the religious options to sort of push against, and this is, I think, what we're seeing now, they start making up a new religion. And 2 or 3 generations into that new religion, it's got some of the same human problems that every religion has. So that's my answer to Cosmic Skeptic. All right. If today you found out that the rapture tribulation will definitely occur in the next 3 to 5 years, what's your plan? Well, first of all, I'm amillennial. I'm not premill. So we could retranslate this into, if I found out that the coming of Christ would occur in the next 3 to 5 years, what's your plan? I don't know that my plan is much different from what I'm doing. Your question provokes a lot of eschatological thinking that I don't have time for. But it's a great question. You know, there's an apocryphal story from Luther which said plant a tree, which I think is a great answer. If you're a Christian, what you're doing now, in some ways, should be exactly what you would do if Christ would come tomorrow. What does that mean? It means, well, then someone might say, oh, okay, so what are the options? Well, I would cash out my retirement account to do exactly what with? To buy luxury items for myself, to give the money for poverty relief in other places, to give money to fuel evangelism. I think I have some deep questions about what a lot of Christians think evangelism is. There's a lot of cheap tricks going on in there. So I think basically Christians should live their lives believing that Jesus can come anytime. And if you're pre-mill and you structure that with a rapture and a tribulation. But I do like Luther's answer of planting a tree. Why? Because, well, I believe that the way eschatology works is that Christ, we don't labor in vain, and he perfects our contributions to the new creation that we make here and now. And so everything I do in my life should be in pursuit of that new creation in you, that new creation in the world. That's what the work of a Christian is. And it looks like evangelism. It looks like all of those things in streams of living water, and so that when revival rolls in like a tsunami, it's just all accentuated. So there's my answer. All right. Oh, Cave Wizard. Cave Wizard's been leaving me messages on my answer. I got to call you, Cave Wizard. I just get busy. So Cave Wizard's been calling my phone, leaving messages. Lubu, hey Paul, I have a Pentecostal background. I see God's goal with creation as being the attempt to make creatures with free will that can be in relationship with him. On Calvinism, I don't see what the point of creation is. Oh. The answer that I hear is that this is for glory, but that sounds like hand waving to me. I hear you talk about agency a lot, but I'm still not 100% sure what your position on this is. I don't see that my position is very different from yours. So God's goal with creation being the attempt to make creatures with free will. See, now I'm betraying this is why you ask me these Calvinist questions. I don't like the term free will. I like agency far better. And I used to talk about real agency, something like that. So now it's just shortened to agency because I'm borrowing some of Vervaeke's vocabulary. I like agency far better. And I really like Vervaeke's observation that in many ways addiction is a reciprocal narrowing of agency. And I think all of the fruit of the Christian life is a broadening of agency. And so that's what I see Calvinism. So Calvinism, one of the real constructs, Al Walters, who is a Canadian who taught at Redeemer University in Canada, which is kind of the north of the border Christian Reformed school up there, wrote a really wonderful little Reformed book, Creation Renewed. And it's Clay Leibold didn't like it when I had my conversation with him, but creation, fall, redemption, restoration. And I understand Clay's critique of that, but another way to frame it would be the agency. God is... So what does evangelism look like? Well, certainly, I think it involves bending one knee to Christ. What does that submission to Christ involve? So my sermon last week, I read the conclusion to an amazing book, The Hiding Place, which is about Corrie ten Boom and hiding Jews and her sister's time in the Nazi prison and her sister's death and then her ministry throughout Europe preaching Tim Keller just wrote a piece on forgiveness, and Keller was right. He's, this woke, people are pointing out, this woke religion has no redemption or forgiveness. It's all law, to look at it from a Lutheran perspective. And what evangelism is, why do we submit to Christ? Well, when Corrie ten Boom faces one of the Nazi prison guards that caused the death and enjoyed killing her beloved sister, Corrie knew she had to forgive. She didn't, her forgiving that prison guard, yeah, it would be politeness for the prison guard. It would have been nobody would have blamed her for looking at that prison guard and saying, go to hell. Nobody would have blamed her for that. But it was their reciprocal broadening of God working through her that gave her the power. And she says it, and I read it, and it's in last week's rough draft. She says, I can't forgive him. Christ, I need your power to do it. And so what happens, and Pentecostal should be all over this, what happens when we come to Christ is, and I will give you my spirit, is that we have his power. And now again, we think of power in all of these comic book superhero ways, which is not necessarily bad in themselves. But the power of Christ is to forgive his enemies. The power of Christ is to take to go up that heavy hill with that cross. And when you get to the top of the hill, to have them put you on that cross, because you're going up even from there. So that's what I don't see. Look at Vineyard. If you want to look at a combination of Pentecostalism and Calvinism, look at the Vineyard Church. There it is. Those are charismatic Presbyterians in the Vineyard Church. However many of them know that, I don't know. Just look at John Wimber. So that's their history. So, oh my goodness. You guys are learning the trick. How can we send Rick across living stones to write on a piece of paper? So, thank you much. Fun games. So, yeah, agency. But in a Pentecostal, well, it's the Holy Spirit through me. That's the Christian life. But it's not, it's not just for the good things that the Spirit gives us in terms of the things that we as consumers, hedonistic consumers, want. It's also the power to love, which is always a costly love. That's what this is about. Yeah, I should really call Cave Wizard. I don't know if you're gonna still be at your mother's house next week. I don't know. Cave Wizard. Why is Jesus Christ Lord and Savior, called Lord and Savior? Lord, because he is the master, and Savior, because he rescues. Being raised in his dominion, he is my Lord. I'd rather have Lao Tzu or the Toltecs for my Lord. Under them I would have peace. Jesus gives me a rage against deceit, makes me care about others, that takes away the peace of emptiness and stillness. Jesus is my Lord and tormentor. Yeah, sometimes, again, reading Mother Teresa. That's a part of it. And the problem with prosperity gospel, or see, if I say Christian hedonism, I invoke John Piper, and he uses that term ironically. In this age, if you live like Jesus, you will get what Jesus got. All right. Long question. Night Ani Cringewalker. Bit of question with everything in the Middle East. Are you aware that Emperor Julian the Apostate attempted to disprove Christianity by rebuilding the temple? No, I'm not. That's interesting. When he began the work, fire erupts and killed all his workers. This was attested to by both pagan and Christian writers. I had never heard any of this stuff. His emperorship ended a few years later on a failed military campaign to try and save his shattered reputation. Yeah, it's so funny because this is where Christ sort of conquers all, because we sort of start with a karmic perception of religion. But then via Job in the Old Testament and Christ, who's the new and better Job, we see that itself is insufficient. But that doesn't mean that it goes away. I mean, part of the validation of Constantine, and it sounds like Julian the Apostate, the negative validation, is in fact the endurance. With that said, I'm reminded how Jerusalem was called the stumbling block for the nations. Yeah, it continues to be. And any who try to lift her up will find themselves laid low. It happens again and again. This event with Julian seems to attest to that promise. Should we expect God to do the same thing with Israel today? It does seem that all who try to help her... Oh, Job, you're playing with me, Job. I know you're playing with me. Job. I say Job. Maybe it's a super chat game. Every time I say Job, he sends in $5. We pattern. Job. It does seem that to all who tried to help her rebuild, find her a stumbling block. Isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting how these things go? It's fascinating. I mean, even the restoration of this, is it a restoration? Is it a creation? I mean, how to think of the state of Israel? Oh, I'm looking for a book. One of my favorite professors in seminary, most of my seminary professors didn't write a lot, David Horta, Jesus in Israel, One Covenant or Two. These are deep, unresolved questions. Jacob will have a thought or two to share, I'm sure. Not right now, but he can talk about that in the Discord server. Theologically speaking, I consider the Christian church to be the third temple. Temple built with that's. I think that's theologically sound. That gets really dicey in a lot of conversations, but we are grafted in where we were cut off. But I'm unsure why God does this to those who try to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Now, again, you get into the Apostle Paul, and you get into those chapters in the middle of Romans 9 through 11 that get all kinds of Calvinists and Augustinians excited. Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. The Apostle Paul very much saw sort of a two-track situation where he said Gentiles come to Christ directly. They do not pass through the law. But Paul was circumcised. He made vows to the temple, and he continued to he was sort of in a liminal space between the Jews and the Gentiles. And beneath this comes, a lot of dispensational theology. So one covenant or two, how are we to think about this? And how are we to regard, historically, the very unfortunate treatment of Christians towards Jews? This is such hard stuff. It's stuff that's beyond us. It's like my answer to the atheist question. These things are beyond us. We don't know. We learn to trust, and as you're trusting, love one another all the way up to and including your enemies. And I don't consider the Jews my enemies, but love the Jews. But it's a really difficult thing to love people, especially when there's conflict. Is it because he is jealous of others, other lovers of his ex-wife? Oh boy. But yet at the same time, okay, so the Persians are still around. The rest is history. I had a great episode on the Persians. Look at the Jews throughout history. It's an astounding story. Almost everything from the ancient world is gone. They remain. And they're blessed. Look at, Nobel Prize winners. Look at wealth. They're cursed and blessed. It's like the story of Israel endures right next to the church. Now, of course, the church has grown large and all that. And so I look at that and I say, God's still writing the story. And, it's for that I'm deeply grateful that Jacob tolerates us. And I love Jacob. And I love his presence here, even though it can be a pain in the ass. But some of my favorite people in the world are a pain in the ass. They hold my attention. So, because it's just the nature. Jacob's also kind of a contrarian, and he's strong-willed and very articulate. So, and then there are all these strange Christian dreams about, like, there's these some of my crazy Calvinist cousins are the Reconstructionists that actually imagine get rid of that mosque on the Temple Mount and rebuild the temple and reinstitute sacrifices. Rushduni and a group of Reformed Christians are in that camp, and The world's a strange place. There's a lot of people out there promoting a lot of stories and narratives. So I would like some perspective. I expect God to once again humble some nations for trying to build a third temple soon. Maybe, I don't know. God is the writer of the story. We're not. Now I sound very Calvinist, don't I? There's a mosque on top of the Temple Mount. I mean, just ponder that. What does that mean? Of course, it means a lot to Islam, because symbolism happens, and that is that in some ways that mosque represents their triumph. And if it weren't for the secular nature of the Jewish state, at least historically up until this point, can you imagine if they bulldozed that mosque? But again, look at the trend lines. It's the observant, conservative, crunchy Jews who are growing in power and numbers, because the secular Jews, do they reproduce? And are their children just melt away into the secularity? I mean, Judaism is what we call Judaism today. It's a very old pattern. And it seems to be the will of God to keep them here. Why? What's he doing with that? I think it's going to be great, because my God writes great stories. And I have no idea what he's doing with it, but I'm like that meme. I got my popcorn. I'm watching because it's going to be dramatic. Gosh, nobody does drama like the Jews in Hollywood and in the Middle East. So, and there's nothing more contentious, conflictive, debated. But again, sitting next to the atheist has got to say, this is what's causing it, or it's chaos, or whatever. Oh, okay. I prefer to see providence. So what God is doing, God's going to do. He is the potter. We are the pot. Okay, where can we find your father's book? Is it available? Search for Stanley Vander Clay on Amazon. It's available on Kindle. You might be able to grab, there's some used copies every now and then that show up there. It was a self-published book. My sister, who passed away, edited it a bit. I just was saying to my sister and my mother recently, I said, at some point it'd be kind of good to go through and re-edit that book and cut it down, make it a little better of a book for public consumption than it was sort of a boutique project, because he wanted to write down his stories, and I'm really glad he did. And so I have, he set aside copies for all the grandkids, copies for all the kids. And then he kept giving books away until my mother stopped him. She's like, "You're just giving books away?" That was my father. He gave money away, he gave books away, gave his time away, gave everything away. That's just what my father did. Then my mother kept him alive, because, no, we have to eat, we need a roof. You can't give all those books away. Let them buy it on Amazon. And so it's Amazon doesn't produce them anymore, I don't think, but you can get them. You can get it via Kindle. Yeah, you'll find stories about me in there, of course. How's Freddie doing? Freddie's doing pretty good right now. He's excited. Freddie really likes the stimulus money. And he's always telling me, "I'm waiting for my next stimulus check." It's like, I don't know that another one is coming. No, I heard that there was. It's like, okay. But he used some of his stimulus money to get some studio time so he could lay down some tracks with Charles. And so then I once mentioned, I said, yeah, Rick and I sometimes talk about putting a studio here at the church that I could make videos in. And Freddie's like, "You're going to put in a studio? And then I can come here and I don't have to pay for studio time, and Rick can cut tracks with me?" I said, "I don't think Rick wants to spend all of his time in the week here cutting tracks with you, Freddie." And besides, we haven't built a studio yet. I don't know that we're going to, but Freddie's doing okay. last week was Mother's Day, and Fancy Nancy came to church because Freddie said he was going to be there. And of course, as is often the case, Freddie didn't show. And so we would have done a show with Fancy Nancy on last week, but Freddie didn't show, so no show. So one of these weeks, Freddie and Nancy will both be in, and we'll have a Freddie and Paul show with Fancy Nancy, and Fancy Nancy can give her usual sermon summary, which I always find quite illuminating to find out what she actually heard. You know, I spend hours during the week crafting and preparing and going to lay this out, and, you know, angels will sing, and the Red Sea will part, and the kingdom will come, and then there's what people hear. And Freddie always hears the same thing. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and then the Calvinist cadet motto. So that's my life, plus these crazy videos and you all. Paul's an extrovert. Yeah, I am. End of questions. Hey, there we are. Well, I guess Hugabumba and Sugar Glass gotta wait till next week. And so we will do this again next week, and then there will be 2 weeks off. You're going to have 2 weeks without this. I fear for, Job, now Job, you're playing games here.
Knock it off, Joe.
Rick wants tacos. I'm going long. Rick's like, where are the tacos? Where are the tacos? So, all right, we better land the plane. Thank you all for watching. I gotta go back there and say hi to James, who was sitting with Rick in the Livingstone studio. And thank you all for being here. So, Rick, you can end transmission.